Victorian garden display in great mansions, public parks and private gardens was intimately related to plant hunting and plant collecting. There was very little that was subtle about mid or late Victorian flower beds, and even the revival of parterres and formal bedding in the reimagined garden of historic houses and their newly built mock 16th, 17th century counterparts were brightly coloured and complex. But how did all this happen? We've just heard Mark's account about planting in the 18th century, but if you look at the figures here, you'll see that the 19th century truly saw an explosion in the number of plant introductions to Britain. Unfortunately, there don't seem to be any comparable figures for non-woody plants, but I suspect that's almost certainly because there are just far too many to count, especially by the 19th century, as a look at any plant catalogue will show you. So there are just a handful of people responsible for lighting the fuse of this explosion. So just to set the scene, the first was Sir Joseph Banks, who had been with Captain Cook, landed at Botany Bay, and on the return voyage had stopped at Cape Town and saw the riches of Cape Flora too. When he got back to Britain, George III effective control of the royal gardens at Kew, and he determined to use them as a centre for the introduction of new plants from the colonies and beyond, and make them in the process the greatest collection in the world. To do that, Banks began a deliberate policy of sending out plant collectors, starting with Francis Masson going to the Cape in 1775, and this continued up until Banks's death in 1820. And the results, of course, are the Kew we know today. Most of the plants, of course, came back in seed or bulb form, because the problems of long sea voyages made transporting live plants extremely haphazard and unsuccessful. And although Banks attempted all sorts of innovations to improve that situation, they weren't very effective. But all these new plants were written up in Kew's own in-house catalogue, the Hortus Kewensis, in 1789. But they were also written up in magazines like Curtis's Botanical Magazine, on the internet, and it's from evidence of contained in Curtis and its later competitors and emulators that we can trace the introduction into horticulture of many garden and greenhouse plants. But what we have to remember is just because they appear in magazines doesn't mean they enter the garden. That can often be decades after the first introduction, because it wasn't really Kew that provided the main impetus for the globalization of the British garden more generally. It was the commercial nursery trade. And that brings me to the second person who helped transform the garden. I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone of the story of Ward's invention. It transformed the possibilities of moving plants around the world. But what you might not know is that his closed glazed case first proved its commercial worth through a partnership with a nursery in Hackney in East London. Run by George Lodgages, they used the case to send plants to Australia and receive Australian plants in return without real loss. And in doing so, that led to a dramatic gear change in commercial horticulture, which led in turn to a dramatic shift in domestic horticulture and made our gardens truly global. So it's with Lodgages I want to start. They publish catalogues most years. This is the 1821. It has 70 pages. There are hundreds of plants on every double page spread. So we've got stove plants here. There are pages of greenhouse plants, hardy trees and shrubs, and hardy perennials. And the only thing that's missing are annuals. Of course, at the time, it was hothouse plants that were considered the most exciting and desirable, because the technology had only recently been improved enough to heat and glaze large greenhouses like Lodgages had. So we have illustrations like this, and unfortunately, no illustrations of the rest of the nursery site. But we have mention of his exotic tree collection, which he ended up planting out in a cemetery, and unfortunately, not much mention of hardier plants or annuals for the garden itself. Unfortunately, Lodgages' lease ran out. They couldn't renew it, and they shut down in 1852 when the site was built over for housing. But by then, their place as a leading nursery had been taken over by James Veitch and his Exeter-based nursery. Veitch was later to move to open a base in King's Road. James Veitch was a natural horticulturalist, but he was also a natural market man. He had a brilliant eye for plants which might be suitable for cultivation and sale. And he mastered the business of propagation and increasing the stock to make profitable numbers. When the nursery opened in 1832, he sent out a letter to potential customers, but he had extensive and choice collections of stove plants, orchidaceous, air plants, geraniums, ericas, and other plants from South Africa and Australia. He had dahlias, which he was then exhibiting. He had bulbs and 12 varieties of scarlet zinnia, which is extraordinary. The idea of there being 12 varieties of scarlet zinnias. These seeds for these, or plants of these, have probably been obtained from other London nurseries, or perhaps European ones, or from ships' officers who bought them back knowing there was a ready market. He began winning medals for his exhibits. He began hybridizing plants such as dahlias, which were comparatively easy to hybridize and exploit commercially. But it wasn't enough for Veitch. He was extremely ambitious, and he now saw an opportunity to secure a continuous supply of new exotics to be sold to the growers. And that was by employing his own plant hunters. The problem was, although he had the money to fund such a scheme, he didn't know enough about where to start. So he turned instead to William Hooker, who had become the first director of Kew, which had been taken into public hands and become the National Botanic Garden, rather than just a royal garden. Hooker was the opposite of Veitch. He, as a civil servant, he had absolutely no money at all, but he had information which Veitch required. So Veitch started asking questions, which I've put up there, and these are all written down in letters. The correspondence between the two still survives in the Kew archives. And once he got the answers to his questions, he set to work. His first collector was William Lobb, who he sent out to South America, where newly independent countries who'd got their independence from Spain were opening up to trade with Europe and to plant hunters. So Lobb went to Brazil, and later on he went to Chile, up to Peru, and finally to the northern coast of South America before going on to California and north of there up to Vancouver. And then soon afterwards, his brother Thomas was sent off in the opposite direction to India and Southeast Asia after orchids and other tropical plants. And you mustn't get the idea that Veitch had thought of something new. This was not new. There were other nurseries doing the same thing. It's just he happened to be the most successful at it. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of what plants they found and how they were. Here's an Alstroemeria, for example, found by Lobb in Brazil, sent back, and 9 months after the seeds arrived, Veitch had it in flower, and 2 years later, it was in commercial production. And as Hooker's, this is a quote from Hooker's botanical magazine, that it was new to our garden and likely to prove highly ornamental. One of the other early plants that William Lobb sent back, is the striking scarlet flowered begonia, Begonia coccinea. This is probably one of his more horticulturally significant introductions because it plays a role as a parent in many, many cultivars. But again, it was Veitch who began that hybridizing. And these exhibitions at the Horticultural Society were visited, of course, by all the major collectors, all the major head gardeners, and they became objects of great desire. Veitch exploited that. You can see here on the list of 15 new and beautiful plants, you'll see at the top the Alstroemeria, a bit further you'll see the begonia underneath it. And further down you'll see gloxinia, for example, which had become very fashionable for amateur as well as commercial hybridizing later in the century. Well, of course, you never see gloxinias really today. What's also interesting is no prices are given. which I suspect means it's a case of if you have to ask what it cost, you can't afford it. Now, initially, of course, Veitches were mainly interested in hothouse plants because they were the fashionable thing because of that improvement in technology. But it didn't take James Veitch long before he realized it was worth looking for trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants in more temperate regions of the world. And most famously, of course, he sent out William Lobb to look for the monkey puzzle. And it appeared in an advertisement for Veitch in Gardener's Chronicle, I think in 1843. And that's usually taken to justify Veitch's claim they had introduced the monkey puzzle into commercial production. In fact, that's not true. They were very good self-publicists, though, and because they said it often enough and loud enough, people believed them. But in fact, there were other nurseries who were already selling monkey puzzles long before Veitch. But the point I'm trying to make is that this one nursery had already made a huge mark on the contents of our greenhouses, but equally importantly, on our gardens and parkland. And by the outbreak of the First World War, they had sent out 22 different plant collectors and introduced 1,281 plants by their own count, I should say, into cultivation. And you can see the range of stuff they were introducing. And they were not the only commercial nursery doing this. But interestingly, it wasn't just commercial nurseries who were actively looking for plants. Kew did as well. They sent William Hooker's son, Joseph, to India to look for rhododendrons. And the London Horticultural Society, now the Royal Horticultural Society, sent out David Douglas to North America, western coast of North America, to look for trees. And here are just a list of some of the trees he sent back. Large quantities of seed of conifers. And when they got back, they were circulated amongst the members of the society, who in fact included Veitch, and Veitch soon put them on to commercial production. It's a slow process, of course, but Douglas is famous for saying when he was asked how many more pines he could find, you'll begin to think I manufactured them, because there were so many new ones coming in. And so you can see how that craze for pinetums began in the middle of the 19th century. It was because of Douglas's new introductions. But the other people who were particularly interested in new plant acquisitions, particularly for non-elite gardens and growers, were Britain's seed companies. There were several of these founded in the late 18th and early 19th century. But very quickly, one emerged as the market leader, and that was James Carter of Carter's Tested Seeds. By the end of the 19th century, they were the largest seed merchant in Britain, near the 20th, probably in the world, although of course they collapsed after the Second World War and disappeared in the 1960s. And they weren't the only major British seed company. Sutton's, for example, were not far behind them, but there were plenty of smaller ones. Their catalogues, until late in the century, were dull, but only to look at. And a closer examination will show you that the range of seeds and bulbs that were available to the whole range of gardeners, not just the elite, but the middle class as well. For example, this double-page spread is just one of several double-page spreads of hyacinths. We forget that hyacinths were once the subject of a mania, rather like tulip mania, which lasted from the late 18th into the early 19th century. And at prices ranging from a few pennies to several shillings a bulb, you just look at the range of colours, varieties, classifications of them. But I think one thing which would be really interesting is to see if any of them are commercially available. I suspect the answer is no, none of them, which of course poses a problem if you're trying to be authentic. It's also a problem because even if you have a name, it's probably very unlikely you'll have an illustration to show you exactly what it looked like, because not many of these plants were actually illustrated by the magazines. And here's just a random page from the flower seed catalogue. And I think you'll find stuff there that you would now only find, if you can find it at all, in a really specialist list, such as Gelitos. But the thing about Carter's is They were absolutely central to the spreading of these plants around the country to a much wider demographic than one might expect. They used their grand connections. You can see here those illustrations are tulips and hyacinths bedded out in the royal parks where they had a contract. On the right-hand side of that piece, you can see collections of bulbs boxed up for sending out in smaller quantities to less elite buyers using mail order. They were the pioneers of mail order in Britain. And very soon, they started adding growing tips to their catalogue too. In fact, by the 20th century, after the First World War, their catalogue becomes a hardback book stuffed with gardening information to not only act as a commercial inspiration, but to really get people going into gardening. But the next question we have to ask ourselves is, what effect does this great explosion in the number of plants coming in have on garden design and garden layout? And the answer is actually it's an enormous effect, because it's coming in at a time when there was a growing understanding and in the revival of historic garden features and layouts and styles, particularly from the 16th and 17th centuries, and the geometric formality. But equally importantly, it's coming in parallel with the theoretical debate about colour. Now, you'd think that's not a particularly significant fact, but up until the early 19th century, there seems to have been very little about a discussion of colour theory, planting in colour combinations. And what's noticeable is when Mark was talking about the amphitheatre at Paynes Hill, there was a great deal of interest taken in the different greens, the colours of trees and shrubs, ensuring there was variety in the range. But it's not until the 19th century when we really see the idea of the flower border being developed that colour begins to be debated thoroughly. And I think that's because it's not only being looked at philosophically, it's being looked at scientifically too. You can see this design here by Matthew Balls, who was the head gardener at Stag and Hoe. And questions like, should colours clash? Should they be complementary? Should they fade from bright to pastel, light to dark? Was green a colour in its own right, or was it merely a foil to other colours? And amazingly, Matthew Balls left a small number of his working documents, which are now in the Garden Museum, which show you precisely how he planned his work. If you could track down the species and varieties he chose, of course, for this parterre, you might be able to work out what line he took on those questions of the importance of colour. The problem is, I think you'd be unable to track down many of the cultivars he was using, or even sometimes the plants. Head gardeners were hybridizing on behalf of their employers all the time, and they were coming up with names which were associated with their employer. For example, I don't know who his employer was at Stag and Hoe, but there's a plant here in the bijou section, which is labelled Mrs. F, which was a plant named for Mrs. Field.